You feel overwhelmed by daily pressures that seem to multiply endlessly, and every setback at work or in life shakes your confidence and disrupts your inner peace. The stress is affecting your sleep, your relationships, and your ability to think clearly, while you watch others maintain their composure under similar pressures and wonder what secret they possess. I am Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who maintained unshakable inner strength while ruling the most powerful empire in history and bearing the weight of millions of lives on my shoulders. The 9 Stoic habits I'll share with you today gave me a fortress of calm that no external pressure could penetrate. Using the same daily practices that sustained me through plagues, wars, and the crushing burden of absolute power. These aren't mere theories. They're the battle-tested disciplines that transformed me from an anxious young man into someone who could find peace in the eye of any storm. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for this transformation. When I was 17 years old, Emperor Hadrian chose me as the heir to his successor, Antoninus Pius. The moment I learned of this decision, I felt as though the entire weight of the world had been placed upon my shoulders, while other young men my age worried about their studies, or which girl might notice them at the next gathering. I lay awake at night, knowing that one day I would hold the lives of 60 million people in my hands. I remember the first time they brought me the purple cloak, that magnificent symbol of imperial power that every Roman citizen revered. As the servants draped it across my shoulders, I felt not pride, but terror. The fabric was heavier than I had imagined, not because of its material, but because of what it represented. Every thread seemed to whisper the names of the countless souls who would depend upon my decisions. Every fold carried the weight of battles I would have to fight, laws I would have to make, and judgments that would affect generations yet unborn. My tutors had given me the finest education the empire could provide. I had studied rhetoric under the greatest speakers of our time, learned law from the most brilliant legal minds, and absorbed the wisdom of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle. Yet none of this prepared me for the crushing anxiety that came with knowing my destiny. Knowledge is one thing. The responsibility to apply it wisely when millions of lives hang in the balance is quite another. I would wake in the middle of the night, my heart racing with questions that had no easy answers. What if I made the wrong decision in a military campaign and thousands of soldiers died needlessly? What if my economic policies led to famine in distant provinces? What if I proved to be a weak ruler and the empire fell into chaos under my watch? These thoughts consumed me, turning my stomach into knots and making it impossible to find peace. Antoninus Pius noticed my distress, though I tried desperately to hide it. During one of our walks through the palace gardens, he stopped beside a fountain and turned to me with those wise, weathered eyes that had seen so much of the world's troubles. "Marcus," he said gently, "you cannot carry the empire on your shoulders before it is even placed there. The weight you feel is not the burden of rule, it is the burden of your own thoughts about rule." Those words confused me at the time, but they planted a seed that would later blossom into my salvation. The problem wasn't the responsibility itself, was my relationship with that responsibility. I was torturing myself with imaginary scenarios, living in a future that might never come to pass, and allowing my mind to create suffering where none yet existed. It was during this period of intense anxiety that fate brought me to the teacher who would change my life forever. Antoninus Pius, recognizing my struggle, arranged for me to study with Junius Rusticus, a man renowned throughout Rome for his wisdom and his mastery of Stoic philosophy. I had heard of the Stoics, of course, but I regarded them as just another school of thought among many. I had no idea that this philosophy would become my anchor in the storms of leadership, my source of unshakable peace in the chaos of imperial responsibility. The night before my first lesson with Rusticus, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest that had become my constant companion. I remember thinking that perhaps this teacher could help me become a more effective ruler, maybe teach me some techniques for making better decisions or speaking more persuasively. I had no conception that he was about to introduce me to a way of living that would transform not just my effectiveness as an emperor, but my entire experience of being human. That young man, lying in his bed, consumed with anxiety about a future he could not control, was about to learn the most important lesson of his life, that true power comes not from controlling the world around you, but from mastering the world within you. Junius Rusticus was not what I expected when I entered his modest study for our first lesson. While most of the learned men I had encountered in the palace dressed in fine robes and surrounded themselves with elaborate decorations to display their status, Rusticus wore a simple tunic and sat in a room furnished with little more than scrolls, a basic wooden desk, and 2 chairs. His presence filled the space not through grandeur, but through an unmistakable sense of calm that seemed to emanate from his very being. "Marcus," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, "tell me what troubles you most about your future." As emperor, I had expected him to begin with some formal lesson about rhetoric or philosophy, so his direct question caught me off guard. For a moment, I considered giving him the polite, careful answer that I had been trained to give to such inquiries. Instead, something about his genuine interest and patient manner encouraged me to speak truthfully. I told him about the sleepless nights, the weight of responsibility that felt too heavy to bear, the constant worry about making decisions that could affect millions of lives. I confessed my fear that I was inadequate for the role destiny had chosen for me, that I would fail the empire and bring shame upon the memory of those great rulers who would come before me. As I spoke, I felt a strange relief in finally voicing these anxieties that had been eating away at me for months. Rusticus listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving my face, his expression neither judging nor dismissing my concerns. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before reaching for a worn scroll from his desk. "Marcus," he said, "I want to share with you the words of a man who understood something profound about the nature of human suffering and the source of genuine peace." He unrolled the scroll and began to read the teachings of Epictetus, a former slave who had become one of the greatest Stoic philosophers of our time. The first passage he shared with me was simple yet revolutionary. "Some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are our opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, position, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing." At first, these words seemed almost disappointingly basic. Of course, some things were within my control and others weren't. This was obvious to anyone with common sense. But as Rusticus began to explain the deeper implications of this principle, I felt something shift in my understanding. He helped me see that I had been exhausting myself trying to control outcomes that were ultimately beyond my power, the opinions of future subjects I had never met, the success of policies that might not be implemented for years, the loyalty of generals in wars that might never be fought. "You see, Marcus," Rusticus explained, "you are torturing yourself with responsibilities that belong to fate, not to you. Your job is not to guarantee perfect outcomes. That is impossible for any human being, even an emperor. Your job is to ensure that when the time comes to act, you act with wisdom, courage, justice, and self-discipline. The rest is not up to you." This was the moment everything began to change for me. Rusticus showed me that I could prepare thoroughly, think carefully, and act with integrity, but I could not control how others would respond to my decisions or what unexpected events might arise to complicate my plans. More importantly, he taught me that this was actually liberating rather than limiting. It meant I could focus my energy on what was actually within my power rather than wasting it on things beyond my control. Over the following weeks, Rusticus introduced me to the full depths of Stoic wisdom. He taught me about the discipline of desire, learning to want what happens rather than demanding that what happens should conform to my wants. He showed me the discipline of action, how to act for the common good while remaining detached from the results. Most importantly, he taught me the discipline of perception, how to see events as they truly are, rather than through the filter of my fears and desires. But it was more than just intellectual understanding that Rusticus provided. He showed me how to practice these principles daily through specific exercises and habits that would eventually become the foundation of my inner strength. He introduced me to the practice of morning reflection, where I would prepare my mind for the day's challenges by reminding myself of Stoic principles. He taught me evening review, where I would examine my thoughts and actions without harsh judgment, but with honest assessment. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There were still nights when anxiety would grip me, still moments when the weight of my future responsibilities felt overwhelming. But now I had tools to work with these feelings, rather than being helplessly consumed by them. I began to understand that peace of mind was not something that happened to me. It was something I could cultivate through daily practice and disciplined thinking. My relationship with the purple cloak began to change as well. Instead of seeing it as a burden I would eventually have to bear, I started to view it as an opportunity to serve something greater than myself. The weight was still there, but now it felt like the weight of purpose rather than the weight of dread. The first habit that truly transformed my daily experience began before the sun ever touched the Roman hills. While the palace still lay shrouded in the quiet darkness of early morning, I would rise from my bed and make my way to my private study, carrying only a lamp and my journal, the collection of personal reflections that would later be called my meditations. Rusticus had introduced me to this practice, but it was through my own daily experience that I discovered its profound power. Marcus, he had told me, the mind is like a garden. If you do not tend to it each morning, weeds of anxiety, anger, and distraction will grow wild throughout the day. But if you begin each day by cultivating the thoughts you want to flourish, you will find that even the most challenging circumstances cannot disturb your inner peace. I began this practice while still heir to the throne, but it became even more essential once I assumed the burden of rule. Those early morning hours, when the empire still slept and the endless stream of decisions, petitions, and crises had not yet begun, became my sanctuary. In that sacred quiet, I would write to myself not for history or for others to read, but as a way of preparing my mind for whatever the day might bring. My morning reflection always began with the same fundamental reminder. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. And so none of them can hurt me. This wasn't pessimism, was preparation. I wasn't assuming the worst about people, but rather acknowledging the reality that I would encounter difficult personalities and challenging situations. More importantly, I was reminding myself that their behavior could not touch my inner peace unless I allowed it to do so. Their actions belonged to them. My responses belonged to me. I would then reflect on the nature of the day ahead, not by trying to control every outcome, but by setting my intention to respond to whatever arose with virtue. I reminded myself that I was not the emperor for my own benefit, but to serve the common good of all people under Roman rule. This daily recommitment to service helped transform the burden of leadership into a privilege of contribution. Some mornings, when particularly difficult decisions awaited me, I would write extensively about the principles that should guide my choices. I might remind myself that courage doesn't mean the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than fear. Or I would reflect on justice, remembering that true fairness sometimes requires making unpopular decisions that serve the greater good rather than my own comfort or reputation. On days when I felt the weight of criticism or political opposition, I would use my morning reflection to practice what I came to call the view from above, imagining myself and my problems from the perspective of the eternal cosmos. From that vantage point, the political squabbles and personal slights that seemed so important at ground level revealed themselves as temporary disturbances in the vast flow of time. This practice never minimized the real importance of my decisions, but it helped me maintain perspective and avoid being consumed by emotions that would cloud my judgment. The physical act of writing was as important as the thoughts themselves. Something about forming words with my own hand, seeing my reflections take shape on papyrus, made the philosophical principles more real and concrete. These weren't abstract ideas I had learned from books, they became personal truths that I was actively choosing to embrace each day. I also used my morning reflection to practice what Epictetus called premeditation of evils, not dwelling morbidly on potential disasters, but mentally preparing myself for the kinds of challenges that any emperor must face. I would imagine receiving news of military defeats, economic crises, or natural disasters, and then reflect on how I could respond to such events with wisdom and composure rather than panic or despair. This morning practice became so essential to my well-being that I maintained it even during military campaigns, when my study might be nothing more than a tent in some remote frontier. Even when illness or the demands of travel made it difficult, I would find some way to begin each day by orienting my mind toward virtue and wisdom, rather than simply reacting to whatever pressures first demanded my attention. What I discovered through years of this practice is that the quality of your thoughts in the first quiet moments of the day sets the tone for everything that follows. If you begin by worrying about all the things that might go wrong, you program your mind to see threats and problems everywhere. But if you begin by reflecting on your values, your purpose, and your capacity to respond wisely to whatever arises, you create an inner foundation that no external circumstance can shake. The morning reflection became my daily return to what mattered most, not the endless details of administration or the petty conflicts of palace life, but the fundamental question of how to live with honor and serve the common good. It was in those quiet moments that I remembered who I wanted to be, regardless of what the day might demand of me. If the morning reflection prepared my mind for the day ahead, the evening review became the practice that allowed me to learn from each day's experiences and continuously refine my character. As the sun set over Rome and the palace began to quiet from the day's endless activity, I would return to my study, light my oil lamp, and engage in what I came to consider the most honest conversation of my life, the conversation with myself about how I had lived that day. Rusticus had taught me that true wisdom comes not from avoiding mistakes, but from learning deeply from the mistakes we inevitably make. A day without self-examination, he would say, is a day lost to growth. The unexamined life may continue, but it does not progress. This evening practice became my way of ensuring that each day contributed to my development as both a ruler and a human being. I would begin each evening review with a simple question: what did I learn about myself today? Sometimes the answer was pleasant. Perhaps I had maintained my composure during a particularly frustrating Senate meeting, or found a creative solution to a complex provincial dispute. But more often, the honest answer revealed areas where I had fallen short of my own standards. Maybe I had spoken more harshly than necessary to a subordinate, or allowed political considerations to cloud what should have been a clear moral decision. The key to this practice was learning to examine my actions and thoughts without the harsh self-judgment that accomplishes nothing except making us feel worse about ourselves. I had to distinguish between useful self-reflection and destructive self-criticism. When I noticed that I had acted from anger rather than reason, or had made a decision based on ego rather than wisdom, I would acknowledge this clearly, but without the kind of self-condemnation that would make me less likely to be honest with myself in the future. I remember one evening, early in my reign, when I had to review a particularly difficult day. I had received news that a rebellion had broken out in a distant province, and my initial reaction had been not the calm assessment that wisdom demanded, but a flash of anger at the rebels for daring to challenge Roman authority. This anger had colored my response throughout the day, leading me to speak more harshly about the rebels than justice required and to consider military solutions before fully exploring diplomatic ones. As I sat with my lamp that evening, writing about this reaction, I had to confront the gap between the emperor the first wanted to be and the emperor the first had actually been that day. I wrote, "Today I allowed my ego to masquerade as justice. I felt personally offended by the rebellion rather than seeing it as a problem to be solved with wisdom and minimal bloodshed. This reaction came from my attachment to being respected, rather than my commitment to serving the common good. This kind of honest self-assessment was painful, but it was also liberating. By acknowledging my mistakes clearly, I could learn from them instead of repeating them. The next time I faced news of rebellion or opposition, I was better prepared to respond from wisdom rather than wounded pride. I also used my evening review to notice and celebrate progress. Philosophy teaches us that virtue is built through countless small choices, and many of those choices can seem insignificant in the moment. But during my evening reflection, I could see patterns of growth that were invisible from day to day. Perhaps I was becoming more patient with difficult senators, or more creative in finding solutions that served multiple competing interests. One aspect of this practice that proved particularly valuable was examining not just my actions, but the thoughts and desires that preceded them. I would ask myself, what did I want today that disturbed my peace? Often, I would discover that my distress had come not from external events themselves, but from my attachment to having those events unfold in a particular way. A delayed message from a provincial governor would frustrate me not because the delay caused any real harm, but because I had become attached to receiving regular updates according to my preferred schedule. Through this evening examination, I learned to trace my emotional disturbances back to their source in my own desires and expectations. This practice gradually freed me from the exhausting cycle of being constantly disturbed by things that didn't go according to my plans. I began to see that peace of mind came not from controlling external events, but from managing my own responses to those events. I would also use my evening review to reflect on the people I had encountered that day. Had I treated each person, from fellow senators to palace servants, with the dignity that their humanity deserved? Had I listened carefully to their concerns? Or had I been too focused on my own agenda to truly hear what they were trying to communicate? These reflections helped me become more present and compassionate in my daily interactions. The evening review became a sacred boundary between each day and the next. No matter how challenging or successful the day had been, this practice allowed me to extract its lessons, acknowledge both my progress and my failures, and then release it completely. I learned that holding on to either the triumphs or the mistakes of the past prevented me from being fully present to the opportunities and responsibilities of the moment. This habit taught me that every day offers chances for growth, but only if we are willing to examine our experiences honestly and learn from them with wisdom rather than harsh judgment. During my second year as emperor, I faced a crisis that seemed to threaten the very foundation of my reign. A coalition of Germanic tribes had crossed the Danube in unprecedented numbers, laying waste to entire provinces and threatening to march on Rome itself. The Senate was in panic. My generals were divided on strategy, and throughout the empire, people whispered that perhaps the gods had withdrawn their favor from their new emperor. I remember standing in my private chambers late one night, staring at the great map of the empire that covered nearly an entire wall. The red markers showing enemy positions seemed to mock me, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that I had known since my youth. The anxiety that comes from feeling overwhelmed by circumstances beyond my control. It was in that moment of despair that I turned to a practice that would become one of my most powerful tools for maintaining perspective, the view from above. This exercise had its roots in Stoic philosophy, but I developed my own particular way of practicing it. I would begin by imagining myself rising above my immediate circumstances, as if my soul could leave my body and observe the situation from an increasingly distant perspective. First, I would see myself standing in that room with the mapper, single man, worried about barbarian tribes. Then I would pull back further, seeing the entire palace, then Rome itself, then the Italian peninsula, then the whole empire spread out like a child's toy beneath me. But I didn't stop there. I would continue rising until I could see the entire Earth as the ancient astronomers described it, a small sphere floating in the cosmic void. From that vantage point, the Germanic invasion that had seemed so catastrophic looked different. It was still serious, still requiring my full attention and best efforts, but it was no longer the world-ending disaster that my anxious mind had made it seem. I would then extend this perspective through time as well as space. I would imagine, looking back from 100 years in the future, when both I and the barbarian chiefs would be long dead, when new emperors would face new challenges, when the current crisis would be nothing more than a few lines in a history book. I thought about the great emperors who had come before me: Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian, and realized that they too had faced moments that seemed insurmountable, yet their empires had endured. This practice never made me careless about my responsibilities or dismissive of real problems. Instead, it freed me from the paralyzing anxiety that comes from seeing temporary difficulties as permanent disasters. The Germanic tribes were still a real threat that required immediate action, but they were no longer a cosmic catastrophe that justified abandoning my philosophical principles or my commitment to wise governance. I began using this exercise in smaller situations as well. When a senator would criticize my policies with particular vehemence, I would imagine viewing the scene from above and through time. From that perspective, I could see that his anger might stem from genuine concern for the empire rather than personal animosity toward me. One could also see that this moment of conflict, which felt so intense and personal in the present, was part of the natural flow of political discourse that had been going on for centuries and would continue long after both of us were gone. The view from above taught me something profound about the nature of human suffering. Most of our distress comes not from events themselves, but from the meaning we assign to those events. When we see things from ground level, consumed by our immediate emotions and desires, even minor setbacks can seem catastrophic. But when we step back and see the larger pattern both spatially and temporally, we often discover that what seemed like a disaster is actually just part of the natural ebb and flow of human experience. I remember applying this practice during the Great Plague that ravaged the empire during my reign. Each day brought reports of thousands of deaths, and I watched helplessly as the disease spread from province to province, despite all efforts to contain it. From ground level, it felt like the end of the world. But when I practiced the view from above, I could see that plagues had come and gone throughout human history. The civilizations had survived them before and would survive them again, and that my job was not to prevent all suffering which was impossible but to respond to this suffering with wisdom, compassion, and practical action. This perspective also helped me understand my role as emperor in a healthier way. From ground level, It was easy to become inflated with self-importance, to believe that the fate of the world rested entirely on my shoulders. But from the cosmic perspective, I could see that I was simply one person in one moment of time, doing my best to serve the common good. This was both humbling and liberating. Humbling because it reminded me that I was not the center of the universe. Liberating because it freed me from the impossible burden of trying to control everything. The view from above became my refuge whenever life felt overwhelming. Whether facing military threats, political opposition, personal losses, or the simple daily frustrations of governing a vast empire, I could always step back and see the larger picture. This practice didn't solve my problems, but it gave me the mental clarity and emotional stability I needed to address them wisely. I learned that perspective is perhaps our most powerful tool for maintaining inner peace. We cannot always control what happens to us, but we can always choose how we view what happens to us. And that choice, the choice of perspective, often makes all the difference between wisdom and panic, between effective action and desperate reaction. I discovered the power of present moment awareness during one of the most stressful periods of my reign, when I was simultaneously managing a military campaign on the northern frontier, while receiving urgent reports about political unrest in the eastern provinces. My mind was constantly racing between regrets about past decisions and anxieties about future consequences, until I realized that I was living everywhere except in the one place where I actually had any power to act. The present moment, the palace. Gardens had always been my refuge, and it was there, sitting beside an ancient sundial that had measured time for generations of emperors before me, that I first truly understood what the philosophers meant when they spoke about the eternal now. The sundial's shadow moved imperceptibly across its bronze face, marking the passage of time that I could neither slow down nor speed up. In that moment of watching, I realized that the past existed only in my memory and the future only in my imagination. The only reality was this exact moment, this breath, this heartbeat, this choice. Epictetus had taught that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and I had proven this truth countless times in my own experience. I would torment myself with memories of decisions I wished I had made differently, or exhaust myself worrying about challenges that might never materialize. Meanwhile, the actual present moment where all my real power resided would slip by unnoticed while my attention was scattered across the landscape of time. I began developing specific practices to anchor my awareness in the present. During meetings with my advisors, instead of allowing my mind to jump ahead to the next appointment or back to previous conversations, I would focus completely on listening to what was being said right now. I discovered that this quality of attention not only made me a better emperor, but also made each interaction more meaningful and productive. When walking through the palace corridors, instead of using that time to worry about the day's challenges, I would pay attention to the feeling of my feet touching the marble floors, the play of light through the windows, the sounds echoing from distant rooms. These simple moments of presence became tiny islands of peace in the midst of imperial chaos. Also learned to use physical sensations as anchors for present moment awareness. During particularly tense negotiations with barbarian leaders or difficult sessions with the Senate, I would notice the feeling of my breath moving in and out of my body, or the sensation of my feet touching the ground. These simple physical realities were always available in the present moment, and attending to them helped keep my mind from spinning off into anxiety or anger. One of the most powerful applications of this practice came during the long military campaigns along the Danube. Army life involves endless periods of waiting for scouts to return, waiting for supply trains to arrive, waiting for weather conditions to improve. I had watched other commanders become increasingly agitated during these delays, their minds consumed with impatience about things they could not control. Instead, I learned to use these moments as opportunities for presence, I would sit in my campaign tent, fully aware of the sounds of camp life around my soldiers talking, horses being tended, the crackling of fires. Rather than seeing these delays as obstacles to my plans, I began to experience them as gifts of time to be fully present. I wrote some of my deepest philosophical reflections during these periods, not despite the military pressures, but because I'd learnt to find peace within them. The practice of present moment awareness also transformed my relationship with unpleasant experiences. When receiving bad news, reports of military defeats, economic problems, or personal betrayals, my first instinct had always been to resist the reality of what was happening, to wish desperately that things were different. But resistance to present reality only added suffering to pain. I learned instead to receive difficult news with what I came to call philosophical presence, acknowledging fully what was happening, without adding the extra layer of emotional resistance that made everything worse. This didn't mean becoming passive or resigned to negative circumstances. Present moment awareness actually made me more effective at dealing with problems because I could see them clearly without the distortion that comes from anxiety or wishful thinking. When I was fully present to a challenge, I could respond to it as it actually was, rather than as my fears or desires made it seem. I also discovered that presence was essential for experiencing joy and beauty. The empire contained countless wonders, magnificent architecture, beautiful art, moments of human nobility and courage, but I had been missing most of them because my attention was always elsewhere. When I learned to be present, these experiences became more vivid and meaningful. A sunset over the Tiber, a moment of laughter with my children, the satisfaction of a well-crafted law, these simple pleasures that were available every day became sources of deep contentment once I learned to receive them fully. Present moment awareness taught me that life is not something that happens to us, is something that happens as us, moment by moment, breath by breath. The past is gone and cannot be changed. The future is uncertain and largely beyond our control. But in this moment, right now, we have the power to choose our response, to act with wisdom, to experience whatever is happening with full awareness. Rather than half-conscious reactivity, I learned to think of each moment as a complete life in miniature. Just as a complete life should be lived with virtue, courage, and wisdom, so each individual moment deserved my full presence and best effort. This perspective transformed even mundane activities, reviewing legal documents, meeting with administrators, eating a simple meal, into opportunities for mindful engagement with life as it actually is, rather than as I wish it were or fear it might become. The practice that perhaps saved my sanity during the darkest periods of my reign was one that many people find counterintuitive, deliberately imagining the loss of everything I held dear. This exercise, which the Stoics called premeditatio malorum, or the premeditation of evils, taught me to find gratitude in the present and strength in the face of adversity by mentally rehearsing life's inevitable challenges before they arrived. First learned this practice from Rusticus, but it was the death of my beloved adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, that taught me its true value. For months before his death, I had sensed that his health was failing, though he continued to perform his duties with characteristic dignity. Instead of pushing away the thought of his eventual death, as my natural instincts urged me to do, I began to practice imagining life without his guidance and presence. Each evening, I would sit quietly and picture receiving the news of his death. I would imagine the immediate shock, the grief that would follow, the loneliness of facing imperial responsibilities without his wisdom to guide me. At first, these visualizations were almost unbearably painful, but gradually they served an unexpected purpose. They made me deeply grateful for each day I still had with him, and they prepared my mind to accept his death when it came as a natural part of the order of things, rather than as a cosmic injustice. When Antoninus Pius did finally die, the grief was still intense and real, but it was not the devastating shock it would have been had I refused to acknowledge its inevitability. More importantly, I had already begun the mental work of preparing to rule without his support, so I could focus my energy on honoring his memory through wise governance, rather than being paralyzed by the surprise of loss. This experience taught me to apply negative visualization to every aspect of my life that I treasured. I would imagine the death of my wife Faustina, the loss of my children, military defeats, economic collapse, even my own death. This wasn't morbid pessimism, was practical preparation for the realities of human existence. By acknowledging that everything I loved was temporary and fragile, I could appreciate these gifts more fully while I had them, and develop the inner resources to maintain my equanimity when they were taken away. I remember practicing this exercise during the height of the Antonine Plague, when death was claiming thousands of lives throughout the empire each day. Instead of pretending that my family and I were somehow immune to this catastrophe, I would spend time each day imagining how I would respond if the plague claimed those closest to me. This preparation didn't protect them from disease, but it did give me the emotional stability I needed to make wise decisions about public health measures, even as I worried about my loved ones. The practice also extended to my imperial position itself. I would regularly imagine being overthrown, losing the respect of the army, or seeing the empire collapse during my reign. Again, this wasn't defeatism. It was mental preparation that freed me from the desperate attachment to success that makes leaders compromise their principles to protect their positions. When I could accept that my reign might end in failure despite my best efforts, I was free to make decisions based on what was right rather than what was politically safe. Negative visualization taught me the difference between appreciation and attachment. When we appreciate something, we enjoy it fully while we have it, and accept gracefully when it's gone. When we're attached to something, we can't fully enjoy it because we're too busy worrying about losing it, and we suffer terribly when loss inevitably comes. The practice of imagining loss helped me develop appreciation while reducing attachment. I would also use this exercise to prepare for smaller daily frustrations. Before important meetings, I would imagine various ways they might go wrong: senators disagreeing with my proposals, administrators reporting budget shortfalls, governors requesting impossible resources. By mentally rehearsing these possibilities, I could respond to them with equanimity rather than frustration when they actually occurred. The paradox of negative visualization is that, by regularly contemplating loss and adversity, you become more capable of enjoying prosperity and success. When you've mentally prepared for the worst-case scenario, anything better feels like a gift rather than an entitlement. A successful military campaign becomes cause for genuine gratitude rather than smug self-satisfaction. A peaceful day with family becomes precious rather than ordinary. This practice also revealed how much of my suffering came from the gap between my expectations and reality. When I expected everything to go smoothly and it didn't, I was miserable. But when I regularly contemplated the many ways things could go wrong, I was pleasantly surprised by how often they went right. The same objective circumstances could be experienced as disappointment or gratitude depending on what I had prepared my mind to expect. I learned to think of negative visualization as emotional insurance. Just as we protect our property against fire and theft, not because we expect these disasters, but because we want to be prepared if they occur. I protected my peace of mind by regularly contemplating the losses and setbacks that are part of every human life. This preparation didn't prevent painful events from happening, but it did prevent them from destroying my inner equilibrium. Perhaps most importantly, this practice taught me that happiness based on external circumstances is inherently fragile, while happiness based on virtue and wisdom can withstand any external storm. When I regularly contemplated losing my health, my wealth, my position, and even my life. I was forced to find sources of contentment that didn't depend on these temporary gifts. I discovered that the one thing that could never be taken from me was my capacity to respond to whatever happened with courage, justice, wisdom, and self-discipline. The revelation that transformed my understanding of success and failure came during my 3rd year as emperor, when I faced a decision that would test everything I believed about leadership and morality. A wealthy senator had been caught embezzling funds intended for grain distributions to the poor, but he was also one of my most influential supporters, and his prosecution would likely cost me important political alliances at a time when I could ill afford to lose them. My advisors urged me to find a quiet way to handle the matter, perhaps allowing him to make restitution privately while avoiding public charges that would embarrass both him and me. From a purely political perspective, this made perfect sense. I would maintain valuable support while still addressing the wrong that had been done. But as I sat in my study that night, wrestling with this decision, I realized that I was being asked to choose between what was expedient and what was right. This was the moment when I truly understood what Epictetus meant when he taught that virtue is the only true good. Everything else that we typically consider valuable wealth, but our character, our commitment to doing what is right, regardless of the consequences, remains entirely within our power and can never be taken from us by external circumstances. I made the decision to prosecute the senator publicly, knowing it would cost me political capital I could hardly spare. Some of my advisors thought I was being foolishly idealistic, prioritizing abstract principles over practical governance. But I had learned that there is nothing more practical than integrity, nothing more effective in the long run than the consistent application of moral principles, even when those principles demand personal sacrifice. This experience taught me to evaluate every situation by asking a simple question: what would virtue require in this circumstance? Not what would be most profitable, most popular, or most politically advantageous, but what would be most just, most courageous, most wise, and most temperate. When I made virtue my primary standard for decision-making, many choices that had seemed impossibly complex became surprisingly clear. I began to understand that true freedom comes not from having the power to do whatever you want, but from wanting only what virtue requires. As emperor, I had more external freedom than perhaps any person in the world. I could command armies, build monuments, even take human life with a word. But I discovered that this external freedom was meaningless unless it was guided by inner principles that I would not compromise regardless of the circumstances. The practice of prioritizing virtue over all other considerations gradually freed me from the exhausting anxiety that comes from basing your peace of mind on things you cannot control. When my primary goal was to act with integrity rather than to achieve specific outcomes, I could find satisfaction even in difficult circumstances. A military campaign that ended in strategic defeat could still be a moral victory if I had conducted it with justice and courage. A political setback that damaged my reputation could be a source of inner peace if I had chosen principle over popularity. This shift in perspective also changed how I evaluated other people. Instead of judging senators by their wealth or influence, I began to assess them by their character. Instead of measuring generals by their victories alone, I considered whether they treated their soldiers with dignity and conducted warfare with appropriate restraint. I found that the people who proved most reliable in crisis were not necessarily those with the most talent or resources, but those with the strongest commitment to doing what was right, regardless of the personal cost. I remember applying this principle during the plague years, when resources were scarce and difficult decisions had to be made about how to allocate medical supplies and government relief. The expedient choice would have been to prioritize the wealthy and influential, the people whose support I needed to maintain stability. But virtue demanded that I consider the needs of all citizens equally, which meant directing resources first to those who were most vulnerable rather than those who were most powerful. The habit of prioritizing virtue also transformed my relationship with criticism and praise. When people attacked my policies or questioned my decisions, I learned to ask whether their criticisms pointed to genuine moral failings rather than simply political disagreements. Criticism that helped me become more just or wise was valuable, regardless of the motives behind it. Praise that came from compromising my principles was meaningless regardless of how widespread or enthusiastic it might be. Perhaps most importantly, this practice taught me that virtue is its own reward. When I acted with integrity, I experienced a deep satisfaction that no external success could match. This wasn't self-righteousness or moral superiority, it was the simple contentment that comes from knowing you have done your best to live according to your highest values. Even in circumstances where virtue led to personal loss or public criticism, I found that I could sleep peacefully knowing that I had chosen character over convenience. I also learned that virtue is not a destination but a practice. Every day brought new opportunities to choose courage over comfort, justice over expediency, wisdom over popular opinion, and self-discipline over self-indulgence. Each time I made the virtuous choice, it became slightly easier to make the same choice. Each time I compromised my principles, it became slightly harder to maintain them in the future. The recognition that virtue is the only true good ultimately freed me from the tyranny of circumstances. External events could still affect me, could still bring grief. Victories could still bring joy, but my fundamental peace of mind no longer depended on having things go my way. As long as I was responding to whatever happened with virtue, I could maintain my inner equilibrium, regardless of whether the outcome matched my preferences. This understanding became the foundation for all the other Stoic practices. Morning reflection helped me recommit to virtue each day. Evening review helped me assess how well I had lived up to virtuous standards. Present moment awareness kept me focused on responding virtuously to whatever was happening right now. The view from above reminded me that virtue matters more than temporary successes or failures. The most difficult lesson I ever had to learn as emperor came not in the marble halls of the palace, but in the muddy camps along the Danube frontier, where I spent the final years of my life fighting wars I had never wanted to fight against enemies I would have preferred to call neighbors. It was there, surrounded by the harsh realities of military campaign, that I discovered the profound difference between accepting your fate and actually loving it. When I first became emperor, I had imagined my reign would be devoted to philosophy, law, and the peaceful administration of justice throughout the empire. I saw myself as a contemplative ruler, perhaps writing treatises on ethics, while overseeing a golden age of Roman culture and prosperity. The last thing I wanted was to spend years of my life in military camps, making life and death decisions about battles and sieges, watching young men die for causes they barely understood. But the Germanic tribes had other plans. Year after year, they pressed against our northern borders with increasing boldness and strength. What began as isolated raids escalated into full-scale invasions that threatened the security of entire provinces. Despite my preference for diplomatic solutions, it became clear that military action was not just advisable, but necessary to protect millions of Roman citizens from conquest and enslavement. I remember the morning I received the final reports that made war unavoidable. I was in my study, surrounded by books on philosophy and jurisprudence, when my military advisors brought news that a massive confederation of tribes was massing for what appeared to be a coordinated assault on our frontier. As I listened to their briefing, I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the old anxiety that came from having my carefully laid plans disrupted by circumstances beyond my control. My first instinct was to resist this unwelcome reality, to wish desperately that the situation were different, to resent the tribes for forcing me into a role I had never wanted to play. I spent days exploring every possible alternative, hoping to find some diplomatic solution that would allow me to remain the peaceful philosopher-emperor I had intended to be. But gradually, I realized that my resistance to the situation was causing more suffering than the situation itself. This was when I began to understand what Epictetus meant when he taught that we should not just accept what happens to us, but actually embrace it as exactly what we need for our growth and development. He called this amor fati, love of fate, and it became the most transformative practice of my entire life. Instead of viewing the Germanic wars as an interruption of my real work as emperor, I began to see them as my real work, the exact challenges that the universe had provided to help me become the person I was meant to be. The shift began with a simple change in language. Instead of thinking I have to go to war, I started thinking I get to discover what kind of leader I become under extreme pressure. Instead of my peaceful reign has been ruined, I told myself, I have been given the opportunity to serve my people in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. This wasn't mere positive thinking. It was a fundamental reorientation toward seeing every experience, pleasant or unpleasant, as raw material for growth and service. I began to apply this practice to smaller frustrations as well. When it rained, during important military operations, instead of feeling annoyed by the weather, I would remind myself that learning to adapt to unexpected conditions was exactly the kind of flexibility that made a better commander. When supply lines were disrupted or communication with Rome was delayed, I practiced seeing these obstacles as opportunities to develop patience and resourcefulness, rather than simply problems to be endured. The transformation was remarkable. The same external circumstances that had felt like burdens began to feel like gifts. Long marches became opportunities for reflection and conversation with my soldiers. Difficult negotiations with barbarian chiefs became chances to practice diplomacy and understand different perspectives. Even the loneliness of command became an invitation to deepen my relationship with philosophical principles that could sustain me when human companionship was not available. This practice of loving my fate extended beyond the immediate circumstances of war to encompass my entire life story. I began to see that every experience I had ever had, including the early anxiety about becoming emperor, the death of loved ones, the political frustrations and personal disappointments, had contributed something essential to my development as both a ruler and a human being. The very challenges I had most wanted to avoid had taught me lessons I could not have learned any other way. I realized that if I had been given the power to design my own life exactly as I preferred, I would have chosen comfort over growth, ease over wisdom, popularity over integrity. The universe, in its wisdom, had given me exactly the experiences I needed to develop the qualities that would serve both myself and the empire most effectively. What seemed like obstacles from my limited perspective revealed themselves as essential elements of a larger pattern that I could trust even when I could not understand it. Loving my fate didn't mean becoming passive or failing to work for positive change. I still fought as effectively as I could against the Germanic tribes, still sought diplomatic solutions whenever possible, still worked to minimize casualties and suffering on both sides. But I did all of this from a place of acceptance rather than resistance, cooperation with circumstances rather than bitter opposition to them. This practice also helped me understand the futility of comparison and regret. Other emperors had ruled during times of peace and prosperity, and I could have spent my energy envying their easier circumstances. But what would have been the point? Their fate was theirs, and mine was mine. Each of us had been given exactly the challenges we needed for our own development and service. My job was not to wish I had someone else's life, but to love the life I had been given completely. The deepest insight from this practice was recognizing that resistance to reality is the source of most human suffering. Pain is inevitable. Loss, conflict, and death are part of the natural order, but suffering is optional. Suffering comes from our refusal to accept what is, our insistence that reality should conform to our preferences, rather than our preferences adapting to reality. When I learned to love my fate, I found that I could experience pain without adding the extra layer of suffering that comes from wishing things were different. The habit that perhaps defined my reign more than any other was one that lifted me beyond the narrow concerns of personal ambition and connected me to something infinitely larger than myself: the commitment to serve the common good of all people under Roman rule. This principle transformed not only how I governed, but how I understood the very purpose of human existence. I learned this lesson most powerfully through the legal reforms I implemented to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. During my early years as emperor, I was appalled to discover the brutal conditions under which many slaves and gladiators lived and died. The law treated them as property rather than human beings, and their suffering was considered acceptable entertainment for the masses. My advisors warned me that reforming these laws would anger wealthy slave owners and disappoint citizens who enjoyed the brutal spectacles of the arena. But I had come to understand that true leadership means serving the welfare of all people, not just those with wealth and influence. I began implementing a series of legal changes that recognized the basic humanity of slaves and gladiators. I prohibited the killing of slaves without legal justification, improved conditions in gladiatorial schools, and created legal protections for slave families. These were not popular measures among the Roman elite, but they were necessary for the moral health of our civilization. What I discovered through this process was that serving something greater than myself provided a sense of purpose and meaning that no personal achievement could match. When I focused solely on my own comfort, reputation, or legacy, I felt restless and dissatisfied no matter how successful I became. But when I directed my energy toward improving the lives of people I would never meet, in provinces I might never visit, I experienced a deep fulfillment that sustained me through the most difficult challenges of my reign. This principle guided my response to the Great Plague that devastated the empire during my rule. As the disease spread from province to province, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives, I could have focused primarily on protecting myself and my immediate circle. Instead, I threw myself into organizing relief efforts, redirecting imperial resources toward medical care and food distribution, and personally overseeing efforts to maintain order and hope in communities overwhelmed by death and fear. I remember walking through the streets of Rome during the worst months of the plague, when bodies were being burned in massive funeral pyres and entire neighborhoods had been abandoned by those who could afford to flee to their country estates. My guards begged me not to expose myself to the disease, but I felt that my duty was to be present with my people during their greatest suffering, not to hide in the safety of the palace while they faced catastrophe alone. This commitment to service taught me that leadership is not about commanding others to serve you, but about dedicating yourself to serving them. The power of the imperial office was not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a responsibility to be exercised for the benefit of all Roman citizens. Every policy decision, every legal judgment, every allocation of resources should be evaluated not by how it benefited me personally, but by how it served the common good of the empire. I also learned that service to the common good requires a long-term perspective that goes beyond immediate political considerations. Many of the reforms I implemented would not show their full benefits until long after my death, and some were politically costly in the short term. But I had to ask myself, would I rather be remembered as a popular emperor who maintained the status quo, or as a leader who made the difficult choices necessary to build a more just and sustainable society? This principle extended beyond my official duties to shape how I interacted with people in my daily life. Whether speaking with senators, soldiers, or servants, I tried to remember that each person was a fellow human being deserving of dignity and consideration. This wasn't always easy. Pallas's life could breed arrogance and entitlement, but I found that treating others with genuine respect not only served the common good, but also enriched my own experience of human connection. The practice of service also helped me understand my place in the larger flow of history. I was not ruling for my own glory, but as a temporary steward of an empire that had existed before me and would continue after me. My job was to leave it better than I found it, to contribute something positive to the great human project of building a more civilized world. This perspective helped me make decisions that served future generations rather than just my immediate political interests. Perhaps most importantly, this commitment to service dissolved the sense of isolation that can come with supreme power. When I focused on serving the common good, I felt connected to every person in the empire, from the wealthiest senator to the humblest farmer. We were all part of the same great endeavor, the attempt to create a society where human beings could flourish in peace and dignity. I discovered that the paradox of service is that the more you give yourself to something larger than your personal interests, the more meaning and satisfaction you find in your own life. When I tried to serve only myself, I felt empty and restless. When I dedicated myself to serving the common good, I found a sense of purpose that sustained me through every challenge and gave dignity to every sacrifice. This habit taught me that we find our truest selves not in selfish pursuits, but in generous service to others. The greatest emperors are remembered not for what they accumulated for themselves, but for what they contributed to the welfare of their people and the progress of human civilization. The final and perhaps most challenging habit that I developed was learning to control not what I had, but what I wanted. This discipline of desire became the cornerstone of my inner freedom, teaching me that true contentment comes not from acquiring everything you want, but from wanting only what you already have, or what virtue requires. This lesson came to me most clearly during the height of my imperial power, when I possessed virtually everything that human beings typically desire in limited wealth: absolute authority, the finest foods and wines, magnificent palaces, the power to command armies and shape the destiny of nations. Yet I noticed that the more I had, the more I seemed to want. Each satisfied desire gave birth to new desires. Each achieved goal revealed new ambitions. Each pleasure left me craving greater pleasures. I began to understand what Epictetus meant when he taught that we are enslaved not by external circumstances, but by our own desires. A poor man who wants little is freer than a rich man who wants much. A slave who has mastered his desires is more liberated than an emperor who is enslaved by his cravings. This insight revolutionized my understanding of what it meant to be truly powerful. I started practicing voluntary discomfort as a way of training my mind to be content with less, rather than always demanding more. Despite having access to the finest delicacies in the empire, I would regularly eat simple bread and water, not as punishment, but as practice in finding satisfaction in simplicity. Instead of always sleeping in the luxurious imperial bedchamber, I would sometimes spend nights on a simple cot in my study, training myself to be comfortable regardless of my surroundings. This wasn't asceticism for its own sake, but practical training in inner freedom. I wanted to know that my peace of mind didn't depend on having access to luxury and comfort. If circumstances ever forced me to live simply, whether through military campaigns, political upheaval, or personal misfortune, I wanted to be prepared to maintain my equanimity regardless of external conditions. The discipline of desire also meant learning to distinguish between my genuine needs and the artificial wants that society had taught me to pursue. I needed food, but I didn't need exotic delicacies from distant provinces. I needed shelter, but I didn't need dozens of palaces. I needed clothing, but I didn't need elaborate robes that cost more than most citizens earned in a lifetime. When I focused on meeting my actual needs rather than my imagined wants, I found that contentment was much easier to achieve and maintain. Perhaps the most difficult aspect of this practice was applying it to my desire for specific outcomes in my imperial duties. I wanted military campaigns to end in swift victories with minimal casualties. One wanted my legal reforms to be immediately popular and effective. I wanted the Senate to support my policies enthusiastically rather than with grudging compliance. These desires, though understandable, often led to frustration and disappointment when reality didn't conform to my preferences. I learned to replace these specific desires with what I called virtuous preferences, hoping for good outcomes while being prepared to accept whatever actually happened with grace and wisdom. I could prefer victory in battle while being ready to respond wisely to defeat. I could hope for political support while being prepared to do what was right, even if it was unpopular. This shift freed me from the exhausting cycle of attachment and disappointment that had characterized my earlier years. The discipline of desire also transformed my relationship with praise and criticism. Initially, I had craved the approval of the Senate, the army, and the people, and I was wounded by any criticism of my policies or character. But I gradually learned to want only what virtue required to act with justice, courage, wisdom, and self-discipline, regardless of how others responded to my actions. This didn't make me indifferent to feedback, but it freed me from the need for constant validation. I remember applying this principle during the difficult negotiations with Germanic tribal leaders. My natural desire was for them to accept Roman terms quickly and completely, ending the conflict on conditions favorable to the empire. But I learned to focus instead on conducting the negotiations with honor and fairness, regardless of whether they led to the outcomes I preferred. This shift in focus actually made me a more effective negotiator, because I could listen to their concerns genuinely, rather than simply trying to manipulate them into giving me what I wanted. The practice also helped me deal with the inevitable losses that come with leadership. When military campaigns failed, when trusted advisors betrayed my confidence, when carefully crafted policies produced unintended consequences, I could experience disappointment without being crushed by it. I learned to want what happened rather than happening to want what I preferred. This discipline taught me that desire is the source of most human suffering. When we want things to be different from how they are, we create a gap between reality and preference that feels like pain. But when we learn to want what is, or at least to accept it fully while working virtuously to improve it, we find a peace that external circumstances cannot disturb. The deepest insight from this practice was recognizing that freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want, but the ability to want whatever you do. A person who can only be happy when circumstances match their preferences is a slave to those circumstances. But a person who can find contentment and purpose, regardless of external conditions, has achieved the only freedom that really matters, the freedom of the human spirit. This final habit brought together all the others, creating a way of living that was immune to the inevitable ups and downs of external fortune. Morning reflection helped me recommit to wanting only what virtue required. Evening review helped me notice when my desires were leading me away from wisdom. Present moment awareness helped me accept what was happening right now rather than demanding that it be different. All these practices worked together to create an inner fortress that no external circumstance could breach. If there was ever a time when my philosophical training faced its ultimate test, it was during the 15 years of the Great Plague that ravaged the Roman Empire during my reign. No amount of theoretical study could have prepared me for the reality of watching a disease sweep through the civilized world, claiming the lives of millions of people while I stood seemingly helpless. To stop it, This catastrophe tested every Stoic principle I had learned and forced me to discover whether my philosophy was merely an intellectual exercise or a practical foundation strong enough to support me through humanity's darkest hours. The plague arrived in Rome like a thief in the night, brought by soldiers returning from campaigns in the East. At first, we dismissed the initial reports as exaggerated accounts of a minor illness that would soon pass. But within months, it became clear that we were facing something unprecedented in its scope and devastation. The disease spread with terrifying efficiency, jumping from person to person regardless of social class, age, or physical condition. Neither wealth nor power provided any protection against this invisible enemy. I remember the morning when my personal physician came to inform me that the plague had reached the palace itself. Several servants had fallen ill overnight, and he grimly predicted that it was only a matter of time before the disease claimed victims among my own family and closest advisors. As I listened to his report, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that I had known since youth, the anxiety that comes from facing circumstances completely beyond my control. This was the moment when all my philosophical training became more than academic exercise. I could either collapse under the weight of helplessness and fear, or I could apply the principles I had been practicing for years to the greatest challenge I had ever faced. I chose philosophy, and it quite literally saved my sanity during the years that followed. My morning reflections during the plague years took on a new urgency and depth. Each day began with the recognition that this might be the day the disease claimed me or someone I loved. I would remind myself that death was always a possibility for every human being, and that the plague had simply made visible a truth that was always present but usually hidden. This wasn't morbid thinking, it was realistic preparation that helped me face each day with courage rather than paralyzing fear. The practice of present moment awareness became essential for maintaining my effectiveness as a leader. It would have been easy to spend all my mental energy worrying about how much worse the plague might become, or regretting decisions I had made that might have contributed to its spread. Instead, I focused my attention on what I could do right. Now organizing relief efforts, maintaining order in communities devastated by loss, ensuring that grain supplies continued to reach cities even when their populations had been decimated. The view from above proved particularly valuable during this period, when I imagined the plague from the perspective of cosmic time and space. I could see that diseases had always been part of the natural order, that civilizations had survived them before and would survive them again. This perspective didn't minimize the real suffering that was happening, but it prevented me from seeing the plague as a unique cosmic injustice that proved the gods had abandoned us. Negative visualization, which I had practiced in peaceful times as a mental exercise, became a daily reality. Every person I cared about was genuinely at risk. Every plan I made might be disrupted by death. Every day might bring news that would test my emotional equilibrium to its limits. But because I had been mentally rehearsing loss for years, I was better prepared to face actual loss with some degree of equanimity. The principle of virtue as the only true good became my anchor during this storm. I could not control who lived or died, but I could control how I responded to this crisis. I could ensure that relief supplies were distributed fairly rather than hoarded by the wealthy. I could maintain my presence in Rome rather than fleeing to a country estate as many nobles did. I could continue to govern with justice and wisdom even when the normal structures of society were breaking down around me. Loving my fate was perhaps the most challenging practice during the plague years. How could I embrace circumstances that involved so much innocent suffering? But I gradually learned that loving my fate didn't mean approving of everything that happened. It meant accepting my role in responding to what happened with maximum effectiveness and minimum resistance. The plague was not something I would have chosen, but it was the reality I had been given, and my job was to serve my people as well as possible within that. reality. The commitment to service sustained me when personal grief threatened to overwhelm me, when friends and family members succumbed to the disease, when entire neighborhoods fell silent, when the normal joys of Roman life disappeared behind a veil of death and fear. I found purpose in continuing to work for the common good. There was always something useful to be done: organizing medical care, ensuring food distribution, maintaining communication between provinces, providing leadership that helped people believe they could survive this catastrophe. The discipline of desire proved essential for maintaining hope without false optimism. I learned to want what was actually possibly effective responses to the crisis, meaningful help for those who are suffering, the preservation of Roman civilization through this trial, rather than wanting the impossible restoration of the world as it had been before the plague arrived. Perhaps most importantly, the plague years taught me that philosophy is not a fair-weather friend. When life is comfortable and circumstances are favorable, almost any belief system can provide adequate guidance. But when you face the ultimate test of watching everything you care about threatened by forces beyond your control, you discover which principles are merely intellectual ornaments and which are genuine sources of strength. My Stoic practices didn't prevent the plague from causing immense suffering, and they didn't protect me from feeling grief for those who died. But they did give me the inner stability I needed to continue functioning as an emperor when the empire needed leadership most desperately. They helped me find meaning in service, even when the future seemed uncertain, and they provided a foundation of peace that no external catastrophe could completely destroy. The plague eventually passed, as plagues always do, but the lessons it taught me about the practical power of philosophical discipline remained with me for the rest of my life. The greatest paradox of my reign was that I discovered my deepest peace while engaged in the most violent circumstances of my life. For nearly 2 decades, I led Roman armies against Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier, making decisions that determined whether thousands of men would live or die, while simultaneously writing some of my most profound reflections on virtue, wisdom, and the nature of human happiness. It was in my military tent, surrounded by the harsh realities of war, that I truly learned how to maintain inner tranquility regardless of external chaos. I had never wanted to be a warrior emperor. My vision of leadership involved philosophical discussions in marble halls, carefully crafted legal reforms, and the peaceful administration of justice throughout the empire. But the Germanic confederations that threatened our northern borders forced me to become something I had never imagined: a commander who would spend more time in military camps than in the palace, more familiar with the sounds of battle than the quiet of the library. The transition was profoundly disorienting. One day I would be in Rome, surrounded by scholars and artists, discussing the finer points of Stoic ethics or reviewing architectural plans for new public buildings. The next, I would be on horseback, surveying battlefield positions and trying to outmaneuver enemy forces who wanted nothing more than to kill me and everyone under my command. The contrast could have shattered my sense of identity if I hadn't learned to find philosophical truth in the most unlikely circumstances. My tent became my mobile philosophy school. Each evening, after reviewing tactical situations with my generals and ensuring that the wounded were receiving proper care, I would retire to write in my journal. These weren't official dispatches or military records, but personal reflections on how the day's experiences had deepened my understanding of Stoic principles. Surrounded by the sounds of an army camp, soldiers talking round their fires, horses being tended, sentries calling to one another through the darkness, I would explore questions about courage, justice, and what it means to live well in a world full of suffering. I discovered that war, despite its horrors, could be a teacher of philosophical truth. When you see men face death with courage, you understand something about human dignity that no book can convey. When you watch soldiers share their meager rations with wounded comrades, you witness virtue in its purest form. When you observe the profound grief of those who have lost friends in battle, you gain insight into the nature of love and loss that peacetime cannot provide. The practice of morning reflection took on new dimensions during these campaigns. Before dawn, while the camp still slept, I would prepare my mind not just for the political challenges of imperial rule, but for the possibility that this might be the day I would have to order an attack that would cost hundreds of lives, or the day enemy forces might overrun our positions and end my own life. These weren't abstract meditations on mortality. They were concrete preparations for realities that could unfold within hours. Present moment awareness became essential for effective military leadership. In battle, there is no time for regret about past decisions or anxiety about future consequences. Your attention must be completely focused on what is happening right now, the movement of enemy forces, the condition of your own troops, the tactical opportunities that might exist for only moments before disappearing forever. War taught me that presence is not just a philosophical ideal, but a practical necessity for effective action. The view from above proved particularly valuable when facing military setbacks. When we suffered defeats, and there were several during the long campaigns, it would have been easy to become consumed with anger, blame, or despair. But when I imagined these temporary reverses from the perspective of cosmic time, I could see them as part of the natural ebb and flow of conflict, rather than personal catastrophes that reflected on my competence as a leader. The discipline of desire was perhaps most challenging in military contexts. My natural desire was for quick, decisive victories that would end the conflict with minimal casualties on both sides. But warfare rarely unfolds according to anyone's preferences. Battles that should have been won were lost due to weather, disease, or simple bad luck. Sieges that should have lasted weeks dragged on for months. Peace negotiations that seemed promising would collapse over seemingly minor disputes. I learned to focus my desires on what was actually within my control, conducting warfare with honor, treating prisoners humanely, maintaining the morale and discipline of my own forces, seeking diplomatic solutions whenever possible, rather than demanding specific outcomes that might be determined by factors beyond my influence. This shift didn't make me passive or less committed to victory, but it did free me from the frustrated rage that can cloud military judgment. The commitment to virtue as the only true good faced its greatest test in the moral complexities of warfare. How do you maintain your integrity while ordering actions that will result in death and destruction? How do you serve the common good when that service requires violence against people who might be fighting simply to protect their own families and homeland? These questions had no easy answers, but they forced me to think deeply about what it means to act justly in an unjust world. I concluded that virtue in warfare meant fighting only when necessary, conducting military operations with restraint and honor, treating enemies with dignity even in defeat, and always seeking the path that would minimize overall suffering while still protecting Roman citizens from conquest and enslavement. These principles didn't eliminate the moral ambiguity of military leadership, but they provided a framework for making difficult decisions with integrity. Perhaps most remarkably, it was during these years of conflict that I wrote my most enduring philosophical reflections. The meditations that scholars would later study were not composed in the peaceful sanctuary of a library, but in the practical crucible of military command. The insights that emerged from this experience were not abstract theories about how to live well, but hard-won wisdom about how to maintain your humanity under the most dehumanizing circumstances imaginable. The war years taught me that inner peace is not dependent on external peace. You can find tranquility in the midst of chaos, wisdom in the midst of confusion, and virtue in the midst of violence, not because these circumstances are ideal for philosophical development, but because philosophy is precisely what allows you to maintain your essential humanity, regardless of what external circumstances demand of you. After years of practicing these 9 Stoic habits individually, I began to understand that their true power emerged not from any single practice, but from their integration into a comprehensive way of living. Like the instruments of an orchestra, each habit contributed its own essential voice to a harmony that was greater than the sum of its parts. This integration transformed my daily routine from a collection of separate exercises into a seamless philosophy in action. My typical day as emperor, whether in Rome or on campaign, became a living demonstration of how these practices could work together. I would begin each morning with reflection, not as an isolated meditation, but as a preparation that drew upon all the other habits. As I wrote in my journal, I would practice present moment awareness by focusing completely on the thoughts I was examining. I would use the view from above to maintain perspective on the day's challenges. I would engage in negative visualization by considering what obstacles might arise and how I could respond virtuously to them. This morning integration set the foundation for everything that followed. When I met with senators who disagreed with my policies, I could listen to their concerns with genuine presence rather than planning my rebuttals. When they criticized me harshly, I could receive their words without defensive anger because I had already practiced loving whatever fate brought me that day. When they proposed solutions that seemed inadequate, I could respond from a commitment to the common good rather than personal ego. The habits supported each other in ways that multiplied their effectiveness. The discipline of desire made it easier to love my fate because I wasn't constantly wanting circumstances to be different from what they were. The commitment to virtue as the only true good gave substance to my service to the common good, because I knew that doing what was right mattered more than achieving popular outcomes. Present moment awareness enhanced my evening review, because I had been fully present to the experiences I was now examining. Discovered that the integration created a kind of philosophical immune system that protected me from the emotional infections that plagued so many leaders when advisors brought news of setbacks or failures. Instead of being overwhelmed by a single strong emotion like anger or despair, I could draw upon multiple practices simultaneously. I would use the view from above to maintain perspective, negative visualization to remember that I had already considered this possibility, and the discipline of desire to focus on responding virtuously rather than demanding that the situation be different. The most remarkable aspect of this integration was how it made virtue feel natural rather than forced. In my early years of practicing Stoicism, choosing the right action often required considerable mental effort and self-discipline. I had to remind myself to be patient, force myself to consider other perspectives, struggle to maintain my composure under pressure. But as the habits became integrated, virtuous responses began to arise spontaneously, from a character that had been gradually transformed by consistent practice. This transformation was particularly evident during the complex negotiations that ended the Germanic Wars. Instead of approaching these discussions as battles to be won or lost, I could engage with enemy leaders as fellow human beings who were trying to serve their own people's interests, just as I was trying to serve Rome's. This perspective, which emerged from the integration of all my practices, made it possible to find solutions that honored the legitimate needs of both sides, rather than simply imposing Roman will through superior military force. The integrated practice also created what I came to think of as philosophical momentum. Each virtuous choice made the next virtuous choice slightly easier. Each moment of presence made it more natural to be present in the next moment. Each instance of loving my fate reduced my resistance to accepting future challenges. The habits reinforced each other in an upward spiral that gradually elevated both my character and my effectiveness as a leader. I began to understand that this integration was what the ancient philosophers meant when they spoke of wisdom as a way of life, rather than just a collection of ideas. The Stoic sage was not someone who had memorized philosophical principles, but someone who had so thoroughly integrated these principles into their daily existence that virtue became as natural as breathing. While I never claimed to have achieved such complete wisdom, I could see the direction in which my practices were leading me. The integration also revealed how each habit addressed a different aspect of human flourishing. Morning reflection cultivated self-awareness and intentionality. Evening review developed honest self-assessment and continuous learning. The view from above provided perspective and emotional regulation. Present moment awareness enhanced effectiveness and reduced anxiety. Negative visualization built resilience and gratitude. Virtue as the only true good created unshakable loving. Your fate eliminated the suffering that comes from resistance to reality. Service to the common good provided meaning and purpose. The discipline of desire created contentment and inner freedom. Together, these practices created a complete system for living well, regardless of external circumstances. They addressed the fundamental human challenges that every person faces: how to maintain hope in difficult times, how to find meaning in suffering, how to act with integrity under pressure, how to balance personal needs with social responsibilities, how to face uncertainty with courage, how to build relationships based on genuine care rather than mutual manipulation. Most importantly, the integration taught me that philosophy is not something you think about, but something you live. The test of any philosophical system is not whether it sounds impressive in academic discussions, but whether it actually helps you become a better person and make a positive contribution to the world. By this standard, the integrated practice of these Stoic habits proved itself every day, in every decision, in every response to the unexpected challenges that filled my life as emperor. The result was not a perfect life. I still made mistakes, still felt grief and frustration, still faced situations where there were no ideal solutions. But it was a life lived with greater wisdom, courage, justice, and self-discipline than I could have achieved without this philosophical foundation. It was a life where inner peace was possible even in the midst of external chaos, where meaning could be found even in suffering, where growth continued even in old age. As I write these words in the final year of my life, camped along the Danube frontier, where I have spent so many years defending the empire's borders, I find myself reflecting not on the territories I have conquered or the laws I have enacted, but on the inner transformation that these 9 Stoic habits have wrought within me. The young man who once lay awake at night, terrified by the weight of imperial responsibility, has become someone who can face even death itself with equanimity and peace. The empire I will leave behind is vast and prosperous, but empires rise and fall according to forces largely beyond any individual's control. The laws I have written may be amended or repealed by future emperors. The buildings I have constructed will eventually crumble to dust. The military victories I have won will become footnotes in history books. But the inner strength I have developed through philosophical practice, this is something that time cannot touch, something that represents my truest legacy to anyone willing to undertake the same journey of transformation. When I think about what these habits have actually accomplished in my life, I am struck not by any single dramatic moment of change, but by the gradual, almost imperceptible shift in my fundamental relationship with existence itself. I no longer wake up dreading the challenges that await me, because I have learned to see challenges as opportunities for growth rather than threats to my peace. I no longer feel crushed by setbacks, because I understand that setbacks are temporary circumstances rather than permanent judgments on my worth as a person. Perhaps most remarkably, I have discovered that happiness is not something that depends on external circumstances aligning with my preferences. True contentment comes from the knowledge that I am living according to my deepest values, serving something greater than my own narrow interests, and responding to whatever life brings with wisdom rather than reactive emotion. This kind of happiness cannot be taken away by political opposition, military defeat, economic crisis, or even the approach of death. The letter I wrote to my son, Commodus, before his ascension to power represents my attempt to pass on this inner legacy. While I could not guarantee that he would face the same external challenges I had encountered, I could at least offer him the tools that had sustained me through every trial. I told him that the throne he would inherit was less important than the character he would bring to it, that the true measure of an emperor is not the territory he controls, but the self-mastery he achieves. But my deepest hope is that this legacy extends far beyond my own family or even the imperial office itself. The principles I have learned and practiced are not secrets available only to those born to power and privilege. Every human being faces the fundamental challenges that these habits address: how to maintain inner peace in difficult circumstances, how to respond to setbacks with wisdom rather than despair, how to find meaning and purpose in the midst of suffering, how to build character that remains stable regardless of external fortune. What I have discovered is that external achievements, no matter how impressive they may seem to others, provide only temporary satisfaction if they are not grounded in inner development. I have known senators who possessed vast wealth but lived in constant anxiety about losing it. I have observed generals who won great victories but remained deeply unhappy because their sense of worth depended entirely on continued success. I have watched philosophers who could speak eloquently about virtue but crumbled when faced with personal adversity because their wisdom was merely intellectual rather than practical. The 9 habits I have shared represent a different path, one that leads to a kind of success that cannot be taken away by changing circumstances. This success is measured not by what you accomplish in the eyes of others, but by who you become in the depths of your own character. It is evaluated not by how much you accumulate, but by how wisely you respond to both gain and loss. It is assessed not by whether you avoid difficulties, but by how you grow through facing them with courage and integrity. I think often about the countless people throughout the empire who will never hold positions of great power or public recognition, but who have the same opportunity I have had to develop unshakable inner strength through philosophical practice. A farmer in Gaul can practice morning reflection just as effectively as an emperor in Rome. A merchant in Alexandria can develop the discipline of desire just as thoroughly as a senator in the capital. A soldier on the frontier can learn to love his fate just as completely as a general commanding armies. This democratization of wisdom is perhaps the most hopeful aspect of the Stoic path. While external circumstances vary dramatically based on the accidents of birth, geography, and historical timing, the capacity for inner development belongs equally to every human being. The tools for building character are available to anyone willing to use them consistently and sincerely. As my own life draws toward its close, I find that I am not afraid of death, not because I am eager to leave this world, but because I have learned to find my security in something deeper than physical existence. The habits I have practiced have taught me that my true self, the part of me that chooses virtue over vice, wisdom over folly, courage over cowardice, is connected to something eternal and indestructible. Whether or not my consciousness continues after death, I know that I have lived in alignment with principles that transcend the temporary concerns of any individual life. This is the legacy I most want to leave, not the memory of a powerful emperor, but the example of a human being who discovered that inner freedom is possible for anyone willing to undertake the disciplined practice of philosophy. The empire may endure or fall, but this truth remains constant across all times and cultures. that we have the power to choose our responses to whatever life brings, and in that choice lies our dignity, our freedom, and our hope. Though I lived nearly 2,000 years ago, I understand that the fundamental challenges of human existence remain constant across time and culture. The person reading these words in your modern era faces the same basic struggles I encountered as emperor: how to maintain inner peace under pressure, how to respond wisely to setbacks and criticism, how to find meaning and purpose in daily life, how to build relationships based on genuine care rather than mutual manipulation. The 9 habits I have shared with you can be adapted to your contemporary circumstances just as effectively as they served me in ancient Rome. You may not rule an empire, but you face your own version of political complexity in your workplace relationships and family dynamics. You may not command armies, but you must navigate conflicts and competing interests in your daily life. You may not govern provinces, but you have spheres of influence where your character and decisions affect others. Let me suggest how you might begin implementing these practices in your modern context. Start with morning reflection, but adapt it to your own schedule and circumstances. You don't need a palace study or an oil lamp. Few minutes with a journal and a cup of coffee before your day begins can serve the same purpose. Use this time to set your intentions, remind yourself of your values, and prepare mentally for the challenges you anticipate. Write down your thoughts rather than just thinking them, because the physical act of writing helps clarify and strengthen your philosophical commitments. For evening review, establish a regular time, perhaps just before bed, to examine your day honestly but without harsh self-judgment. Ask yourself what you learned about your own character, where you responded wisely to challenges, and where you might have chosen differently. Notice patterns in your behavior and emotional reactions. Celebrate growth without becoming complacent, and acknowledge mistakes without becoming self-critical. The view from above can be practiced whenever you feel overwhelmed by immediate circumstances, when you're stuck in traffic, frustrated by workplace politics, or anxious about financial pressures. Step back mentally and see your situation from a broader perspective. Imagine viewing your current challenge from a year in the future, or from the perspective of someone living in a different century. This doesn't minimize real problems, but it helps you respond to them with greater wisdom and less emotional reactivity. Present moment awareness requires no special equipment or formal meditation practice, though such practices can certainly help. Simply make a conscious effort to fully engage with whatever you're doing right now. When you're in a meeting, listen completely rather than planning what you'll say next. When you're eating, taste your food rather than scrolling through your phone. When you're with family or friends, be genuinely present to them rather than mentally rehearsing tomorrow's agenda. Negative visualization might be the most challenging practice to adapt to modern sensibilities, because your culture often encourages relentless optimism and positive thinking. But I encourage you to spend a few minutes each week imagining the loss of things you value: our health, your job, your relationships, your possessions. This isn't pessimism, but preparation that builds both resilience and gratitude. When you regularly contemplate loss, you appreciate what you have more fully and develop the inner resources to handle setbacks with greater equanimity. The principle of virtue as the only true good may seem abstract, but it becomes practical when you use it as a decision-making framework. In any challenging situation, ask yourself, what would courage, justice, wisdom, and self-discipline require here? Not what would be most profitable, most popular, or most comfortable, but what would be most virtuous. This question can guide you through ethical dilemmas in business, family conflicts, political disagreements, and personal challenges. Loving your fate requires perhaps the most significant shift in perspective for modern practitioners. Your culture often teaches that you should try to control outcomes and become frustrated when things don't go according to plan. Instead, practice focusing your energy on what you can actually control: your effort, your attitude, your choices, accepting what you cannot control with grace. This doesn't mean becoming passive, but rather directing your active efforts toward what can actually be influenced by your actions. Service to the common good might seem overwhelming in an interconnected, global world, but it begins with small acts in your immediate sphere of influence. Look for ways to contribute positively to your workplace, your community, your family. Volunteer for causes you care about. Mentor someone who could benefit from your experience. Vote thoughtfully and stay informed about issues that affect others. The scale doesn't matter as much as the genuine commitment to something larger than your own immediate interests. The discipline of desire is particularly relevant in a consumer culture that constantly encourages you to want more and be dissatisfied with what you have. Practice voluntary simplicity, occasionally at simple meals. Take walks instead of expensive entertainment. Spend evenings reading rather than shopping online. Notice the difference between what you actually need and what advertising tells you to want. Learn to find contentment in what you already possess rather than constantly seeking happiness through acquisition. The key to successful implementation is starting small and building gradually. Don't attempt to transform your entire life overnight. Choose one or two practices that resonate most strongly with your current circumstances and commit to them consistently for a month. Once they become natural habits, add others gradually. The goal is not perfection, but progress, becoming gradually more wise, more resilient, more compassionate, and more effective in serving both your own growth and the welfare of others. Remember that these practices work best when integrated rather than pursued in isolation. Morning reflection prepares you for present moment awareness throughout the day. Evening review helps you learn from the experiences you've fully engaged with through presence. The discipline of desire supports your ability to love your fate, while service to the common good gives meaningful direction to your virtuous choices. Most importantly, be patient with yourself as you develop these habits. I spent decades learning to apply these principles effectively, and I never achieved perfect consistency. The value lies not in flawless execution, but in sincere effort sustained over time. Each day offers new opportunities to practice wisdom, and each practice session strengthens your capacity for the next challenge you'll face. As I prepare to leave this world and return to the cosmic order from which I came, I want you to understand something profound. You do not need an empire to practice these habits, but practicing these habits will make you the emperor of your own life. The purple cloak and golden throne were never the source of my power. They were simply the external circumstances through which I learned to exercise the only authority that truly matters: mastery over my own thoughts, emotions, and choices. Every morning when you wake up, you face your own imperial moment. You may not have armies to command or provinces to govern, but you have something infinitely more important: the power to decide who you will be today. Will you respond to challenges with wisdom or reactivity? Will you treat others with dignity or dismiss them as obstacles to your agenda? Will you choose courage when facing difficulties or retreat into comfort and avoidance? These choices, multiplied across days and years, determine the quality of your character and the impact of your life. The throne you truly occupy is the throne of your own consciousness. From this seat of power, you rule over a vast inner empire, consisting of your thoughts, desires, fears, hopes, and dreams. Most people live as subjects in their own kingdom, controlled by impulses they never examine and reactions they never question. But you have the opportunity to become the philosopher-emperor of your own existence, governing your inner world with the same wisdom and discipline that I tried to bring to the Roman Empire. Your daily routine is your imperial court, and every person you encounter is a citizen deserving of your best leadership. Whether you're interacting with family members, colleagues, strangers in a store, or people who disagree with your opinions, you have the chance to exercise the kind of leadership that elevates others rather than diminishing them. You can listen with genuine attention, speak with honesty and kindness, and act with integrity even when no one is watching. The challenges you face, financial pressures, relationship conflicts, career setbacks, health concerns, political disagreements, these are your Germanic tribes, your plagues, your difficult provinces that require wise governance. They are not obstacles to living well, but opportunities to practice the virtues that make life meaningful. Each difficulty you navigate with wisdom and grace strengthens your character and prepares you for greater challenges ahead. Your sphere of influence may seem small compared to an empire, but every life touches countless others in ways both visible and invisible. The patience you show to a frustrated customer might change their entire day. The courage you display in standing up for your principles might inspire someone else to do the same. The compassion you offer to a struggling friend might provide exactly the support they need to persevere through their difficulties. These moments of positive influence create ripple effects that extend far beyond what you can see or measure. Most importantly, you have the power to leave a legacy that will outlast any external achievement. The character you build through consistent practice of these habits becomes part of who you are in a way that no external success can match. When you develop genuine wisdom, courage, justice, and self-discipline, you become a source of strength and inspiration that continues to influence others long after your specific accomplishments have been forgotten. I encourage you to begin this journey today, not tomorrow or next week, or when circumstances become more favorable. The present moment is the only time you actually have, and it contains all the raw material you need to start building the life you truly want to live. You don't need perfect conditions or ideal circumstances. You need only the willingness to begin where you are with what you have. Choose one of the 9 habits that speaks most powerfully to your current situation. If you're feeling overwhelmed, start with morning reflection to bring intentionality to your days. If you're struggling with disappointment, practice loving your fate by accepting what cannot be changed, while working wisely to influence what can be. If you're feeling isolated or purposeless, look for ways to serve the common good in your immediate environment. Remember that transformation happens gradually through consistent small actions rather than dramatic, sudden changes. Each time you choose presence over distraction, virtue over convenience, wisdom over reactivity, you are strengthening the inner muscles that will sustain you through whatever challenges life brings. Each practice session makes the next one slightly easier and more natural. The path ahead will not always be comfortable. There will be days when you feel discouraged, when the habits feel difficult or artificial, when external circumstances test your resolve. This is normal and expected. Even emperors have difficult days. What matters is not perfection but persistence. Not avoiding all mistakes, but learning from the ones you make. Not feeling strong all the time, but returning to your practices even when you feel weak. As I write these final words, watching the sun set over the Danube frontier, where I have spent so many years learning to live with wisdom, I feel profound gratitude for the philosophical path that has sustained me through every joy and sorrow of my long life. The habits I have shared with you are not merely my personal opinions, but time-tested practices that have guided human beings toward flourishing for centuries. You stand now at the threshold of your own philosophical journey. The choice is yours. Will you live as a subject of your circumstances, blown about by every wind of fortune and emotion, or will you claim your birthright as the emperor of your own existence, governing your inner world with the wisdom and discipline that create unshakable peace? Take up your crown. Your empire awaits.